Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. I'm Daniel McAdams, normally the co-host, but with Dr. Paul away, I'm in the hot seat. Today, we are going to discuss the iPhone issue, and I'm very happy to be joined by my old friend Peter van Buren, who we first met back in Capitol Hill days. He came and spoke to one of Dr. Paul's Thursday luncheons. Mr. Van Buren spent 24 years as a State Department official. He left after publishing an expose on what a disaster Iraq was. That book was called We Meant Well, How I Helped Lose the Hearts and Minds of the Iraqi People. Most recently, he has published a piece of fiction, Ghosts of Tom Joad, a story of the 99%. Peter, thanks so much for joining us again.
It's always a pleasure, Dan. I just want to reiterate again for your viewers that when I was working as a whistleblower, when I wrote that expose about Iraq, only Dr. Paul was the only member of Congress, including my own representatives, who was willing to meet with me, and I owe him a great debt for his support.
Well, that's great. You know, when I picked up the book, I think your publisher sent it over to us. I picked it up. I literally could not put it down, and I put it in the hands of Dr. Paul and said, this is a great book. It's whoever hasn't read it yet, you should read it because it is such a great story. And you're such a great writer, and thankfully, with your permission, we reprint a lot of your great pieces on the Ron Paul Institute site. But today we want to talk about the iPhone issue, and I know we've talked about it a lot on this show, and we keep talking about it, and the reason we do is because it's so important. And Peter, you, in a recent piece you did yesterday on your website, you really, in a beautiful little 700-800 word piece, explained to us why it is really important. So if you want to give us a quick overview of your piece and why you would urge people to pay more attention, go ahead and shoot.
Absolutely. You know, when someone writes the history of these times, there are going to be seminal events that stand out. And one of them is going to be the struggle between the U.S. government and Apple over encryption. The FBI, the NSA, the CIA has been working for years to get Congress to pass laws that allow them to bypass the encryption that many of us use on the internet, on our phones, to conduct our business in private, guaranteed by the Fourth Amendment. Encryption, as we know from Edward Snowden, can be broken, but it takes time and it takes enormous computing power. What the NSA wants to do, of course, is mass surveillance, everything. And they don't have yet the time or the computing power to break encryption across the internet. And so what they want is what's called a backdoor, a way to bypass the encryption and see the material that you and I would like to transmit privately as if it was in the open. Congress so far has been reluctant to make that a law, to force companies like Apple or Google to offer these backdoors to the government. And so now the FBI, in what we'd have to call a bit of evil genius, thinks they found a way to press Congress into doing that. As many of your listeners know, the FBI has in its possession a cell phone that was used by one of the San Bernardino shooters. And through their own incompetence, the FBI actually locked themselves out of that cell phone. And as Apple users know, after you do 10 password tries, the phone either locks itself permanently or actually deletes the data, depending what operating system you're using. And so the FBI can't get into the phone. They know that, but maybe, we'll get back to that. But they currently claim they can't get into the phone, and after 10 password tries, they'll never get into the phone. And so what they've done is they've gone to court and had a court agree with them that Apple must comply with their request to give them a back door. In this case, Apple would have to write basically an amendment to the iOS operating system that would allow the FBI to have an infinite number of password tries at as fast a speed as the FBI's computers, or probably the NSA's computers, can push those passwords in until they find one. It's called a brute force attack. Once such a tool exists, this new operating system, well, then basically government can use it at any time in order to access the phone. And once the dam is open and Apple has to do it, well, Google has to do it, and everybody else. The evil genius of all this is that if the courts rule in the FBI's favor, well, great, they've got the tool that they need. If the courts rule against the FBI and in favor of, in this case, the people, that say we have a Fourth Amendment right to privacy. Well, at that point, the FBI has some very powerful ammunition to take back to Congress. They've picked a very interesting test case here. It's not a drug dealer. It's not a run-of-the-mill bad guy. It's a real live terrorist. It's a guy who was influenced by ISIS, who shot up a bunch of innocent people. You can't get badder than this bad guy. More importantly, he's dead. He doesn't have any personal privacy rights, and he doesn't have the right. No one's going to sue them or try to stand against them on personal grounds. They're also going after Apple, who's a big company that is going to defend themselves, and there's not going to be any question about, well, this was unfair, or they picked on some small guy who had no way to defend himself. This will be a major event. And if the courts say no, then they're going to be able to go to Congress and say, see, we told you. We told you there's no other way to do this. The next San Bernardino shooter's blood is on your hands, Congress, unless and until you pass the laws that give us the back doors that allow us to spy indiscriminately on all Americans.
Doesn't that sound exactly like the Patriot Act? They had it on the shelf. They wanted to unveil it. They had to wait until their Pearl Harbor event until they could unveil it. You know, it's all about propaganda. And in your piece, I think you put an underscore to this when you said that the government had unsealed the case, which is pretty unprecedented. Obviously, they wanted people to see the PR. They wanted people to see what a terrible case this was, and we've got to get in there.
And this shows us how far things have, I guess, regressed since 9/11. The Patriot Act was passed in virtual secrecy. In fact, as we know now, most of the people who voted in Congress in favor of it had never even read it. And then the Patriot Act was supplemented by a number of secret court decisions and executive orders that made it actually even worse. We've only found out about parts of the Patriot Act, even now 15 years later, and how they impact us. In this Apple case, we've seen now that the government has moved to the point where they feel they can push this into the face of the American people and say, look what we can do, look what you're going to have to put up with, so you just better get used to it. And unfortunately, it's been successful. A majority of Americans, in fact, support the FBI in this matter.
Yeah, and it's the success of PR. And you captured this in a little phrase that I wrote down, I paraphrased, but this really is the essence of the whole issue. Should tech companies provide secure products for their customers, or do they act as tools of law enforcement? That seems to me a fundamental question of our existence in 21st century United States.
Absolutely, and that's why, as I said at the opening, when history records what happened in this era, this Apple case is going to be one of the markers, one of the points where we took a turn in the road, either in favor of our liberty or against our liberty. This is crucial in our society as more and more of our lives move online, and we depend on devices like our smartphones and the technology that will be evolving in the future. If this case is successful for the FBI, then basically they have, to use a word, militarized private industry in the United States as an extension of their own surveillance tools and perhaps someday their own enforcement tools. What if, for example, this is extended to the point where companies are allowed to not sell their products and services, that the FBI, for example, would claim that Dan McAdams is a potential terrorist for X, Y, and Z reasons, and therefore he shouldn't have access to the internet. He shouldn't have the ability to carry a cell phone because, well, he'll just use it to communicate with terrorists.
Yeah, this is the big thing, because there are a lot of people who don't use iPhones. They probably aren't paying very close attention. Why do I care? What's the big deal? But you point out that this could expand that what they're using, this All Writs Act, which was written in the 18th century, this could expand it exponentially to deal with things like medical records and other things. So even if you would never buy an iPhone in your life, this affects you.
Absolutely, and the All Writs Act is worth mentioning just because it shows the sleaziness of government, the willingness to manipulate laws that are 200-some years old for modern circumstances. The All Writs Act was passed in 1789 and basically is what we consider now enabling legislation. It was a brand new country in 1789, and they sort of had to create all the rules and laws from scratch. The All Writs Act basically said if the courts of the United States order you to do something, you have to do it. And in 1789, that was pretty basic stuff. If the court said, hey, you got to pay your neighbor 1 pig and a cow in return for burning down his barn, you had to go through with that. Now, 250 years later, the courts are being asked to take that same principle and apply it to something as encompassing and as important and as critical to our constitutional rights as whether or not we are allowed to communicate in private or not. It is shameful.
Yeah, it is. It's incredible, as if the Constitution doesn't exist, just this little obscure act. But, you know, we don't have a lot more time, but we've got to get to one other item, and you thankfully brought this to my attention, that Ed Snowden recently commented on this whole issue of the FBI saying, this is the only way we can get this terrorist information. If you're against it, you know, what's wrong with you? Are you on this guy's side? And he, go ahead and explain, Peter, he has a very different view of the FBI's case.
Basically, Edward Snowden issued a statement today. Actually, he was talking to a computer conference, and he said that the FBI's claim that there is no other way to get into this except with Apple's help is BS. I think he used another word other than BS, but we're being family friendly here. Basically, what he said supports what we've been talking about, that this is all a ruse, that the FBI could certainly figure out a way into the phone. In fact, some tech people online have made suggestions about how that could be done, but they don't want to. They want it to appear that the only thing that stands between terrorism running amok in the United States and the safety of the American people is the ability of the government to break encryption. It's evil genius. It's brilliant propaganda. It's brilliant manipulation. But I tell you what, Dan, at this point in American history, I'm probably going to trust Edward Snowden on this issue a lot more than the FBI.
Well, especially when Director Comey has, every time he's opened his mouth, he's contradicted himself. But in the closing part, I think we'll save the best for last in a way, because this is something that Dr. Paul and I talked about, and you mentioned it as well. And it's also mentioned in this Brian Clark's article in the Next Web News. And this is really the key, and this is the kicker. This is not about the FBI wanting to break a terrorist's phone. This is about the FBI and the U.S. government wanting Congress to come in and set standards for encryption across the board for everyone. And we know how Congress is going to rule on this. We know our privacy doesn't have long to be protected if Congress gets in the act. So this is the real goal.
Yes. Absolutely. And the FBI is manipulating the system, and they're using what the basic tool that they've used, the government has used since September 12th, 2001, which is fear. We need to be able to break encryption, or we're not going to be able to protect you from terrorism. That fear is a very powerful motivator, particularly with a Congress that is already predisposed to give government additional tools. Fear is going to push a lot of the undecided members of Congress to the FBI side. And once that door is open, it doesn't close. The other quick point to add is that once that door is open, in this case the FBI wants it available to them, the CIA, the NSA, the American government writ large. But, you know, this is technology. It can't be contained. So once the FBI can break encryption, it remains statistically impossible to imagine that technology will not migrate to other countries, to terrorist organizations themselves. The FBI is saying, America, take the locks off the door, and your privacy and your security, in fact, be damned.
Yeah, it's a chilling thing, Peter, and I hope that our viewers are going to really get more interested in this topic, and that Americans will stand up and say, this is enough. But Peter, I want to thank you so much for joining us. It's always very enlightening to talk with you, speak with you, to read your work. So thanks for being with us, Peter.
Dan, thank you for having me, and thank you for the work that you and Dr. Paul do. There are few people in these dark times who are willing to speak as clearly and as loudly as your organization does. And please, please, we need you. Keep doing it.
Thank you, Peter. And I want to thank everyone out there for continuing to watch the Ron Paul Liberty Report. We're growing rapidly. We need more subscribers and more viewers so we can reach critical mass. But thank you all for watching us. Thank you for tuning in. And please continue to watch the Liberty Report.